In 1099, Christian Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, massacring its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. But how did this happen? How did the mighty Islamic world, which had once swept across continents, fail to repel a relatively small army of European knights? The answer lies in disunity, fragmentation, and political rivalry. This is the story of the First Crusade, and how Muslim disunity helped the Crusaders win. The Seljuk Turks had shattered the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and had established control over Syria and Palestine. But their empire was a patchwork of rival princes, each vying for power. The central Seljuk authority was weakening rapidly after the death of Sultan Malik Shah in 1092. The Fatimids, meanwhile, had lost control of Jerusalem to the Seljuks in 1073. Their influence in the Levant was minimal, and they were more concerned with defending Egypt and maintaining power at home. The Abbasids in Baghdad had become figureheads. Real power was in the hands of Seljuk sultans and military commanders. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, urging European Christians to reclaim Jerusalem, the Muslim world was in no position to mount a united defense. The Crusaders began their march in 1096. But from the moment they entered Muslim lands, there was no coordinated resistance. Why? Because each Muslim ruler saw the Crusaders not as an existential threat, but as a foreign issue, or worse, a useful distraction. In Anatolia, the Seljuks were more focused on fighting each other than confronting the incoming Crusaders. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, based in Nicaea, was caught off guard and lost the city to the Crusaders in 1097. In Syria, key cities like Aleppo and Damascus were under the control of different Seljuk emirs. These emirs didn't trust each other, and certainly didn't coordinate defense against the Crusaders. When the Crusaders besieged Antioch in 1097 to 1098, the local Seljuk ruler, Yagi Sian, received no help from his fellow Muslim princes. Reinforcements came too late, and after a brutal siege, Antioch fell. Even worse, Muslim rulers sometimes allied with the Crusaders to defeat their Muslim rivals. The Fatimids in Egypt, for example, attempted to negotiate with the Crusaders, hoping to retain control of southern Palestine. By the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in 1099, it was no longer under Seljuk control. The Fatimids had retaken it just 1 year earlier, in 1098, but they had no time to fortify it properly, and their garrison was small. The Fatimids did not expect the Crusaders to march further south. They had wrongly assumed the Crusaders would be content with Antioch and the surrounding territory. In June 1099, the Crusaders began their siege of Jerusalem. The city's defenders, largely Fatimid troops, held out for about a month, but they were overwhelmed. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders broke through the city walls. What followed was one of the bloodiest massacres of the medieval period. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were slaughtered. The survivors were enslaved or expelled. Muslim rulers were stunned, but their reactions were slow, fragmented, and ultimately ineffective. The fall of Jerusalem did not unite the Muslim world. Seljuk rulers continued fighting among themselves. The Fatimids were too weak to respond, and it would take nearly 50 years before a strong leader, Zangi, would begin the process of reconquest. It wasn't until the rise of Saladin in the late 12th century that the Muslim world truly began to present a unified response to the Crusader presence. In the decades after the First Crusade, a new narrative began to spread through Friday sermons, courtly speeches, and scholarly texts. Jihad, not just as personal struggle, but as armed defense of the Muslim community. Islamic scholars emphasized that it was a religious duty to reclaim lands lost to non-Muslim invaders. One of the earliest and most important voices was Al-Ghazali. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, one of the most influential theologians and jurists in Islamic history, played a subtle but crucial role. Living through the early years of the Crusader presence, Al-Ghazali called on Muslims to return to orthodoxy, moral discipline, and spiritual unity. While not a battlefield commander, he laid the intellectual foundation for the Jihad movement. A few decades later, in Baghdad, another figure took this message to the streets. Ibn al-Jawzi, a fiery preacher, historian, and theologian, Ibn al-Jawzi delivered sermons that electrified the masses. He didn't just scold rulers, he stirred public emotion, creating a popular religious consciousness that framed the Crusades as a direct attack on Islam. His sermons made jihad a moral and spiritual imperative for all Muslims, not just soldiers or scholars. Before the Crusades, the Islamic world was fractured. Seljuks, Fatimids, Abbasids, each with their own agendas. But the shock of Christian conquest, especially the fall of Jerusalem, began to forge a new idea: pan-Islamic identity. For the first time in generations, Muslims in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt began to see themselves as part of a single community under siege. Jihad was not just a call to arms, it was a call to unity, a reminder that the Ummah, the collective Muslim nation, was bound together by faith and had a shared duty to defend itself. These early ideological shifts paved the way for actual military revival. By the mid-12th century, leaders like Zangi and later Nuruddin would declare jihad as a rallying cry. not just to fight the Crusaders, but to unite Muslim territories. They commissioned public sermons, funded scholars, and declared themselves the champions of Islam. The term mujahid, one who fights in the cause of God, became a symbol of honor. And eventually it would be under Saladin that the jihad movement would bear its greatest fruit, the retaking of Jerusalem in 1187. The jihad movement didn't rise overnight. It was built on spiritual calls, popular awakening, and a growing sense of shared identity. Thinkers like al-Ghazali gave it intellectual legitimacy. Preachers like Ibn al-Jawzi gave it fire, and future rulers gave it power. The rise of jihad after the First Crusade was more than just a military response. It was a civilizational revival. Imad ad-Din Zangi was born around 1085 in Tikrit, the same town that would later produce Saladin. He rose through the ranks under the Seljuk Empire, eventually becoming the governor of Mosul in 1127, and later Aleppo in 1128. Zangi was no ordinary warlord. He was a military genius, a ruthless strategist, and a shrewd political manipulator. But above all, he was a man who understood the power of religious legitimacy. While others vied for local power, Zangi saw a bigger picture: a Muslim world united through jihad. Since the First Crusade, the Islamic world had remained fractured. The Seljuks squabbled over territory. The Fatimids of Egypt, a Shia dynasty, had stood by while Jerusalem fell. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad held symbolic authority, but no real power. Zangi saw an opportunity. By promoting jihad, he positioned himself not just as a regional governor, but as the defender of Sunni Islam and the liberator of Muslim lands. He revived the doctrine of jihad, not merely as spiritual struggle, but as a military obligation against Christian occupiers. This was no longer about dynastic rivalry. This was about the survival of Islam. In 1144, Zangi struck a decisive blow. He turned his attention to Edessa, the first Crusader state established in 1098, and also the most vulnerable. Its ruler, Count Jocelyn II, had foolishly left the city underdefended while campaigning elsewhere. Zangi saw his chance. From December 1st to December 24th, 1144, Zangi laid siege to Edessa. His army used siege towers, battering rams, and relentless assaults. On December 24, the walls were breached. The city fell. Thousands of Christians were killed or enslaved. The Latin Christian world was stunned. This was the first major Muslim victory against the Crusaders since the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. Zangi didn't just celebrate the military victory, he turned it into a religious rallying cry. He had sermons delivered in mosques across Syria and Iraq. He declared the capture of Edessa as a triumph of jihad fi sabilillah, struggle in the path of God. This was the first truly organized jihad campaign of the Crusades era, led by a ruler who framed it as both divine duty and political strategy. By seizing Edessa, Zangi presented himself as the legitimate champion of Islam. He minted coins in his name, had the Friday sermon read in his honor, and styled himself protector of the faith. This gave him moral authority that even the Abbasid Caliph could not challenge. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through Christendom. For the Crusaders, Edessa was supposed to be secure. Its loss shattered their illusion of dominance and exposed the vulnerability of their positions. In 1145, Pope Eugene III issued a papal bull calling for a second crusade. It would be led by the kings of Europe themselves, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Imad ad-Din Zangi did not live to see the Second Crusade unfold. He was assassinated in 1146 by one of his own slaves during the siege of Qalat Jabbar. But his legacy endured. His son Nur ad-Din inherited his mission. Nur ad-Din Mahmud, son of Zangi, inherited Aleppo in 1146 after his father's assassination. His brother Saif al-Din took Mosul. Though sons of the same man, each ruled independently. At just 29 years old, Nur ad-Din faced a region plagued by factionalism. The Muslim world was still divided between Seljuk vassals in Iraq and Syria, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and ambitious local emirs who prioritized survival over solidarity. But Nur ad-Din had a vision. Not just survival, but unity under Islam. Nur ad-Din wasn't a typical warlord. He was deeply religious, highly educated, and surrounded himself with Islamic jurists and scholars. He built his authority not just on military might, but on moral legitimacy. He funded madrasas across Aleppo and Damascus to teach Sunni orthodoxy. He emphasized justice as a ruler's core duty, personally hearing complaints from the poor and enforcing accountability. He had the Friday khutbah sermon read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph, reinforcing his Sunni credentials. In 1154, Nur ad-Din made his boldest move yet. He captured Damascus. Damascus had long resisted Zangi's rule and even allied with Crusaders to preserve independence. But Nur ad-Din knew that to lead a broader jihad, he needed a unified Syria. He capitalized on internal divisions and political discontent in the city. Rather than sacking it, he entered peacefully, hailed by locals for his piety and justice. With Damascus under his control, Nur ad-Din became master of northern and central Syria. For the first time in decades, Syria was politically unified, ready to resist the Crusaders not as rival city-states, but as a single Islamic force. Nur ad-Din didn't stop with military victories. He understood that jihad without faith was hollow. He poured resources into Islamic institutions, built the Nuriya Madrasa in Damascus to train jurists in the Shafi school of law, founded hospitals by Maristans, libraries and public works funded by Waqf, religious endowments, sponsored Quranic recitation contests, public sermons and scholarly debates to promote Sunni orthodoxy. Once Syria was united, Nur ad-Din began mobilizing for a broader pan-Islamic jihad against the Crusaders. He launched border raids on Crusader strongholds in the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but he also supported jihad intellectually, commissioned preachers to spread jihad sermons across mosques, supported historians and poets who glorified martyrdom, promoted the idea of Muslim solidarity, not tribal or regional loyalty. In the eyes of many Muslims, the Crusader presence was no longer just a political crisis, it was a spiritual emergency. Though Nur ad-Din never lived to see Jerusalem retaken, he planted the seeds. In 1169, his general Shirkuh and young subordinate Saladin were sent to Egypt to wrest it from the Fatimids, and succeeded. By 1171, Saladin had abolished the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, and Egypt was once again under Sunni control, loyal to the Abbasids and to Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din died in 1174, just before Saladin declared himself Sultan of Egypt and Syria, but his legacy was profound. He turned jihad from a slogan into a state ideology. He made religious legitimacy a cornerstone of political power, and he laid the ideological and military groundwork for the liberation of Jerusalem in 1187. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, was born in Tikrit in 1137, to a Kurdish family. He came of age in the court of Nur ad-Din Zangi, where he trained in military strategy, Islamic law and governance. In 1169, Saladin accompanied his uncle Shirkuh on a campaign to Egypt, defeating Crusader-aligned forces and dismantling Fatimid power. When Shirkuh died, Saladin, then just in his early 30s, was appointed vizier of Egypt. Many thought he was a placeholder. They were wrong. Saladin quickly consolidated Sunni rule by abolishing the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, aligned Egypt with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, purged rivals with care and diplomacy, and began preparing for his true ambition, jihad against the Crusaders. Saladin's genius was not just on the battlefield, it was in uniting fractured territories. Between 1171 and 1186, he brought Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and parts of Arabia under one rule. This was unprecedented. For the first time since the Crusades began, a single Muslim ruler controlled the land surrounding the Crusader states. He preached jihad, but not as a slogan, rather as a moral duty, grounded in the Quran and the teachings of Nur ad-Din. By the summer of 1187, Saladin was ready. The Crusaders, led by Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, were lured into the dry hills near Tiberias, far from water, in scorching heat. Saladin's army cut off their access to water and encircled them. The Battle of Hattin was a masterclass in strategy. Muslim forces set dry grass ablaze to suffocate the Crusaders in smoke. They launched wave after wave of archery. The exhausted Christian army collapsed. The relic of the true cross was captured. Most of the Crusader nobility was taken prisoner. It was the greatest disaster in Crusader military history. Saladin spared many, but executed the Knights Templar and Hospitaller viewed as fanatical and merciless in previous conflicts. With the Crusader forces broken, Saladin marched on Jerusalem. The city's defenses, once formidable, were now manned by few soldiers and terrified civilians. The commander Balian of Abelin negotiated terms of surrender. Unlike the massacre of 1099, Saladin entered Jerusalem peacefully. No widespread slaughter, no looting. Christian inhabitants were allowed to ransom themselves. Eastern Christians were left in peace, their churches untouched. Even some Western Christians were freed without payment, out of mercy. Saladin ordered the cleaning and reconsecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He wept at the sight of Jerusalem returned to Muslim hands. Saladin's reputation wasn't just built on war, but on Islamic ethics and chivalry. He lived modestly, gave away his wealth in charity and refused luxury. He was respected even by his enemies for his honor and humanity. When Richard the Lionheart's sister fell ill during the Third Crusade, Saladin sent his personal physician and gifts. He refused to retaliate for Crusader atrocities with massacres of his own. To Muslims, he became the symbol of a righteous ruler, deeply committed to faith. To Christians, he became a paradox, a noble enemy. Saladin died in 1193, not long after the Third Crusade ended in a truce with Richard the Lionheart. At his death, his personal treasury contained almost nothing. He had given it all away. In the modern era, especially after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of European colonialism, the language of the Crusades returned, not in history books, but in political rhetoric. In the 20th and 21st centuries, leaders, revolutionaries, and extremists on both sides have invoked the Crusades to frame conflicts. Osama bin Laden referred to Western intervention as a new crusade. George W. Bush, after 9/11, famously used the word crusade, a statement that sparked backlash across the Muslim world. But here's the truth. The historical Crusades were not modern holy wars. They were driven by medieval concerns, papal power, land, salvation, feudal rivalry, and local politics. Likewise, jihad in the 12th century was not a globalized call for violence. It was localized, defensive, and rooted in religious obligation to protect territory and community. Modern use of crusade and jihad often distorts their meaning. The Crusaders were not a monolithic Christian army. They were divided, often fighting each other. Jihad was not synonymous with terrorism. It included military defense, but also spiritual struggle, charity, and social justice. The pan-Islamic identity that emerged during the later Crusades wasn't a blueprint for modern Islamic politics, but rather a reaction to crisis. When history is used as a weapon, context gets lost.